In the vast, silent reaches of the Andromeda sector, a quiet panic was unfolding. The Galactic Federation had made a decision it would soon regret: to invade a planet so chaotic, so unpredictable, that even the bravest warlords trembled at its name: Earth. And at the center of this cosmic miscalculation stood one man, one beard, one legend: Buck Boomstick Bronson. "You've got to be kidding me," Krell 427 chittered, his antennae twitching in disbelief as he stared at the holographic display. "They're going to invade that planet." Blip 789, his fellow galactic scout, buzzed in agreement. "I know, right? It's like they've got a death wish or something. But you know how the High Command is. Once they set their sights on a world, there's no talking them out of it." Bias. The two aliens were huddled in their cloaked observation pod, hovering high above the surface of the blue-green planet designated as Sol 3 by the Galactic Federation. To the rest of the universe, it was known simply as Earth, a Class 5 death world that most sensible species avoided like the plague. Krell sighed, a sound reminiscent of a deflating balloon. "Well, I suppose we should at least warn them about the inhabitants." "What did the locals call themselves again?" "Humans," Blip replied, tapping away at his data pad. "Bipedal primates, carbon-based average lifespan of around 80 rotations. Primitive technology by our standards, but they're advancing rapidly." Yes, humans." Krell nodded, his compound eyes gleaming with a mix of fascination and horror. Blip chittered a sound that passed for laughter among their species. "Oh, that's nothing. Do you remember the incident with the Flurbian trade delegation? Apparently a human child asked if she could keep one as a pet because they looked like, and I quote, cuddly blue teddy bears." "By the Great Hive Mother?" Krell exclaimed, his exoskeleton paling slightly. "And the High Command wants to invade these creatures? It's like they're asking for trouble." As if on cue, their sensors began beeping urgently. Blip's appendages flew over the control panel, bringing up a new holo display. "Speaking of trouble," he muttered, "we've got movement on the surface. Looks like..." "Oh no." Krell leaned in, his antennae quivering with anticipation. "What is it? Some kind of advanced weapon? A doomsday device?" "Worse," Blip replied grimly. "It's a human, and something else. Something big." The two aliens watched in rapt fascination as the scene unfolded before them. Deep in the forests of Montana, United States, a burly, bearded man named Buck Boomstick Bronson, yes, that was his actual name, thank you very much, was having what he would later describe as a real doozy of a day. It had started normally enough. Wake up at the crack of dawn, eat a breakfast that would make a cardiologist weep. Bacon, eggs, more bacon, and a side of bacon, and head out into the wilderness for some good old-fashioned nature communing. You know, the kind where you carry enough firepower to start a small war, just in case Mother Nature decides to get frisky. Chuck was an avid outdoorsman, a self-proclaimed apex predator, and the proud owner of a beard that could house a family of squirrels comfortably. He was also, unbeknownst to him, about to become Earth's first line of defense against an alien invasion. As he trudged through the underbrush, muttering curses about mosquitoes the size of small birds, Chuck suddenly froze. There, not 20 yards away, stood a massive grizzly bear. And when I say massive, I mean it made other bears look like teddy bears that had gone on a crash diet. Now, any sane person would have slowly backed away, perhaps while saying a prayer or two. Chuck, however, was not what most people would call sane. Instead, he grinned, revealing a set of teeth that had seen better days and possibly better decades. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying a hint of challenge and a whole lot of crazy. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here, Mr. Bear. Now, I don't want no trouble, but if you're fixin' for a fight, you best believe Buck Boomstick Bronson ain't one to back down." The bear, for its part, looked utterly bewildered. It was used to creatures running away in terror, not engaging in pre-fight banter. For a moment it seemed to consider its life choices, perhaps wondering if it should have gone into hibernation early this year. Chuck, interpreting the bear's hesitation as a sign of weakness, decided to up the ante. He puffed out his chest, which was impressive considering it was already the size of a whiskey barrel, and let out a roar that would have made a lion think twice. "Come at me, you overgrown furball," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the trees and probably scaring the living daylights out of every woodland creature within a 5-mile radius. The bear, deciding that its dignity was at stake, rose up on its hind legs and roared back. The sound was like a freight train with indigestion, shaking leaves from the trees and causing small avalanches in distant mountains. Back in the observation pod, Krell and Blip watched the unfolding scene with a mixture of horror and fascination. Is that human challenging an apex predator to single combat? Krell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blip, who had been frantically searching their database, nodded slowly. "According to our records, that's a grizzly bear, highly aggressive, known for its strength and ferocity. No sentient being in their right mind would willingly engage one." "Then that human must be the planet's mightiest warrior," Krell exclaimed, his eyes wide with awe. Blip hesitated. "Well, actually our data suggests he's what humans call a Florida man. Apparently it's a subspecies known for its unpredictable behavior." "Unpredictable?" Krell chittered nervously. "You mean there are humans even crazier than this one?" Before Blip could answer, their attention was drawn back to the holo display, where the confrontation had escalated to a whole new level of insanity. Buck Boomstick Bronson, living up to his ridiculous name, had decided that the best course of action was to charge head first at the bear. Now, it's worth noting that Chuck was not a small man. Years of eating nothing but red meat, drinking nothing but whiskey, and exercising solely by wrestling alligators, don't ask, had turned him into a human battering ram. As he sprinted towards the bear, letting out a war cry that sounded suspiciously like Leroy Jenkins, he was, after all, a man of culture. The bear had a moment of clarity. It realized that perhaps it had made a terrible mistake in life choices that had led it to this moment. The collision between man and bear was spectacular. It was like watching a freight train hit a furry mountain. Sound echoed through the forest, sending birds flying in panic and causing nearby trees to question their life choices as well. For a moment, everything was still. Then, defying all logic and several laws of physics, Chuck emerged from the tangled fur and limbs, holding the bear in a headlock. "How do you like them apples, you walking carpet?" Chuck roared, his face red with exertion and what was probably an unhealthy level of enthusiasm. The bear, for its part, looked thoroughly confused. This was not how things usually went in the forest. Typically, smaller creatures ran away, or at the very least, had the decency to be eaten quietly. This loud, smelly human was breaking all the rules of nature. In the observation pod, Krell and Blip were having an existential crisis. Did that human just tackle a creature 3 times his size? Krell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blip, who had been furiously taking notes, nodded slowly. "It appears so, and now he seems to be trash-talking it." Indeed, Chuck had not let up on his verbal assault, As he maintained his grip on the bear, he launched into a monologue that would have made professional wrestlers green with envy. You think you're tough, huh? I've fought meaner things than you in my breakfast cereal. I once arm wrestled a tornado and made it apologize. I eat nails for breakfast without any milk. The bear, having never encountered SpongeBob SquarePants references in the wild, was understandably perplexed. It let out a confused whimper, which only served to fuel Chuck's bravado. "Oh, what's the matter, Yogi? Forgot to pack your picnic basket?" "Well, let me tell you something, buddy. The only thing you'll be snacking on today is a knuckle sandwich with a side of whoop-ass." Back in the pod, Blip turned to his partner, his antennae drooping in defeat. "We have to call off the invasion." Krell blinked all four of his eyes in rapid succession. "What? But the High Command?" "The High Command can shove their invasion plans up their excretory orifices," Blip exclaimed, waving his appendages wildly. "Did you not see what just happened? That human, that insane, gravity-defying, logic-defying human, just body-slammed a creature that, by all rights, should have turned him into a red smear on the forest floor. But our technology," Krell began, only to be cut off again. "Our technology?" Blip laughed, a sound like marbles in a blender. "What good is our technology against a species that looks at nature's perfect killing machines and decides to wrestle them for fun? No, my friend, we're calling this off. I'd rather face the High Command's wrath than whatever madness these humans would unleash upon us." Meanwhile, blissfully unaware of the cosmic implications of his actions, Buck Boomstick Bronson was having the time of his life. He had somehow maneuvered himself onto the bear's back and was now attempting to ride it. "Yee-haw!" Chuck bellowed, clinging to the bear's fur as it bucked and roared in protest. "This ain't my first rodeo, Smokey. Though I gotta say you're a mite hairier than the usual broncos." The bear, having finally had enough of this indignity, made a desperate attempt to shake off its unwanted passenger. It reared up, spun around, and then in a move that would have impressed any gymnastics coach, performed a perfect backflip. Chuck, displaying the kind of acrobatic skill that would make Olympic gymnasts question their life choices, somehow managed to stay on. As the bear landed with a thud that probably registered on seismographs 3 states over, Chuck let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy. "Hi, diggity dog. That was better than any roller coaster I've ever been on. Hey, bear, you ever thought about a career in the circus? We could make a fortune." The bear, realizing that it was dealing with a creature far madder than anything it had encountered in its years of roaming the wilderness, decided that enough was enough. With a final desperate heave, it managed to dislodge Chuck, sending him flying through the air. Now, any normal human would have been concerned about the impending impact with the ground. Chuck, however, was far from normal. As he soared through the air, he struck a pose that would have made Superman proud. "I believe I can fly," he sang, badly off-key, and with far too much enthusiasm for someone about to have a close encounter with terra firma. The landing was, well, let's just say it was memorable. Chuck hit the ground with all the grace of a sack of potatoes thrown from a moving truck. He rolled, bounced, and finally came to a stop at the base of a large pine tree. For a moment, everything was still. The bear, panting heavily, eyed the prone human warily. Birds, which had been silent during the entire ordeal, cautiously began to chirp again. A squirrel, braver or perhaps more foolish than its brethren, peeked out from behind a tree to survey the scene. Then, defying all logic and probably several laws of biology, Chuck sat up. He was covered in dirt, leaves, and what appeared to be the remnants of several unfortunate mushrooms. His beard, which had somehow grown even more magnificent during the fight, now housed not just a family of squirrels, but what looked like an entire ecosystem. Chuck blinked, looked at the bear, and then did something that would haunt the dreams of Krell and Blip for years to come. He laughed. It wasn't a chuckle or a giggle, or even a hearty guffaw. So, this was the kind of laugh that started deep in the belly, rumbled up through the chest, and exploded out with enough force to make nearby trees consider taking a few steps back, if trees could in fact take steps. "Hoo-hoo," Chuck bellowed, pumping his fists in the air. "Now that's what I call a nature walk. Hey there, fuzzy buddy. How about we go another round? Best 2 out of 3. The bear, having apparently reached its quota of insanity for the day, and possibly the entire year, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. With a final confused look at the still laughing human, it turned tail and lumbered off into the forest, probably to find a therapist, or failing that, a really stiff drink. In the observation pod, Krell and Blip sat in stunned silence, their alien minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Did that just happen?" Krell finally managed to squeak out, his voice several octaves higher than usual. Blip, who had been frantically recording every moment of the encounter, nodded slowly. I think it did. Unless we've both gone insane, which at this point, I'm not ruling out. We have to report this to the High Command, Krell said, his antennae drooping in defeat. They need to know what we're up against. Blip chittered in agreement, already dreading the conversation to come. How do we even begin to explain this? Dear High Command, please cancel the invasion, because we watched a hairy biped engage in physical combat with an apex predator for fun. Don't forget the part where he tried to ride it like some sort of furry transport beast, Krell added helpfully. Oh yes, because that makes it sound so much more believable, Blip replied, his voice dripping with enough sarcasm to fill a small ocean, as the 2 aliens began composing their report, desperately trying to find words in their language to describe the sheer insanity they had just witnessed. Buck Boomstick Bronson was picking himself up off the forest floor, brushing leaves and twigs from his beard, and evicting a family of very confused chipmunks in the process. Chuck surveyed his surroundings with the air of a conquering hero. His clothes were torn, he was covered in scratches, and he was pretty sure he'd lost a boot somewhere during the scuffle. All in all, it was shaping up to be a pretty good day. Well, he mused aloud, his voice carrying the peculiar mix of pride and mild concussion. I reckon that's enough excitement for one morning. Time to head back and tell the boys at the bar about my little tussle. Might need to embellish it a bit, though. Maybe throw in a mountain lion or 2. Can't have them thinking I'm going soft. As Chuck began his triumphant march back to civilization, or at least to the nearest establishment that would serve him a beer before noon, he remained blissfully unaware of the cosmic implications of his impromptu wrestling match. He didn't know that, high above the Earth's atmosphere, 2 alien observers were frantically revising their invasion plans. He had no idea that his actions had just saved humanity from becoming the newest addition to the Galactic Federation's list of conquered worlds. All Chuck knew was that he had a hell of a story to tell, and a powerful thirst that needed quenching. As he trudged through the forest, occasionally pausing to pull thorns from unmentionable places, Chuck began to compose his tale in his head. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, the story had grown to epic proportions, featuring not just one bear, but an entire family of them, each one bigger and meaner than the last. And then he practiced, his voice carrying through the trees and causing a nearby rabbit to seriously reconsider its life choices. I looked the Papa Bear straight in the eye and said, "Listen here, you overgrown carpet sample. I've had just about enough of your grisly shenanigans." Chuck paused, considering his word choice. Maybe grisly shenanigans is a bit much. How about bearable behavior? Nah, too subtle. Oh, unbearable attitude, that's the ticket. As Chuck continued his journey, perfecting his tale with each step, the alien observers in their cloaked pod were facing a crisis of galactic proportions. "What do you mean, call off the invasion?" The holographic image of Grand Admiral High Overlord Varnox sputtered, his tentacles writhing in agitation. "What? Do you have any idea how much paperwork I had to fill out to get this approved? The requisition forms alone took 3 solar cycles." Zax and Blip exchanged nervous glances. How does one explain the concept of a Florida man to a being whose species reproduced by budding and considered emotions a sign of weakness? "Well, you see, sir," Blip began, his antennae twitching anxiously. "We've observed some unusual behavior from the inhabitants of this planet." "Unusual how?" High Overlord Varnox demanded, his eye stalks narrowing suspiciously. "They're primitive bipeds on a Class 5 death world. Everything about them is unusual by our standards." Krell, deciding that in this case a picture was worth 1,000 words, or, in their language, a series of clicks and whistles, activated the holo-recording of Chuck's bear wrestling exploits. For several long moments, there was silence in the pod, as Grand Admiral High Overlord Varnox watched the scene unfold. His expression, normally unreadable to most species, went through a range of emotions that the 2 scouts hadn't even known their kind was capable of expressing. Finally, as the recording ended with Chuck's triumphant laughter echoing through the forest, High Overlord Varnox spoke. His voice was unnaturally calm, like the silence before a supernova. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said slowly, each word dripping with disbelief. "This creature, this human, willingly engaged in physical combat with one of the planet's apex predators." "Yes, sir," Blip confirmed, nodding so vigorously his antennae almost tied themselves in knots. "For fun," High Overlord Varnox continued, his voice rising slightly. "It would appear so, sir," Krell added helpfully. "And not only did he survive, but he seemed to enjoy the experience." "He did mention something about wanting to go another round, sir," Blip said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grand Admiral High Overlord Varnox was silent for a long moment, his tentacles writhing in what the scouts assumed was deep thought. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a tone they had never heard before, something that, in a less advanced species, might have been mistaken for fear. "Scouts," he said, his holographic image seeming to deflate slightly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are to maintain your observation of this planet, but under no circumstances are you to engage with the inhabitants. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," both scouts replied in unison, relief evident in their voices. "Good." High Overlord Varnox nodded. "I'll inform the High Command that we need to reevaluate our invasion strategy. Perhaps we should consider a nice, peaceful Class 2 planet instead. I hear the methane swamps of Zorban 5 are lovely this time of year." With that, the holographic image flickered and disappeared, leaving Krell and Blip alone in the sudden silence of their observation pod. "Well," Krell said after a moment, his antennae drooping with relief. "That went better than expected." Blip nodded, already turning back to the monitoring equipment. "Indeed. Now let's see what other surprises this planet has in store for us. After all, if one human can cause this much trouble, imagine what the rest of them are capable of." So meanwhile, blissfully unaware of the interstellar crisis he had just averted, Buck Boomstick Bronson had finally made it back to civilization, or at least the closest approximation of it, in this part of Montana. The Rusty Nail Saloon stood like a beacon of hope and questionable hygiene standards at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the afternoon sun. As Chuck pushed open the door, the familiar sense of stale beer, beef jerky, and regrettable life choices washed over him. The bar's patrons, a motley crew of fellow outdoorsmen, local characters, and the occasional lost tourist, all turned to look at the newcomer. For a moment, there was silence. Chuck stood in the doorway, backlit by the sun, his beard still housing several twigs and possibly a small family of field mice. His clothes were torn, his face was scratched, and he was sporting the kind of grin that made sensible people take a step back. Then as one, the bar erupted in cheers. "Chuck, you old son of a gun," bellowed Big Mike, the bartender and owner of the establishment. "What in tarnation happened to you? You look like you went 10 rounds with a wood chipper." Chuck swaggered up to the bar, leaving a trail of forest debris in his wake. "Oh, not much," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Just had a little tussle with a grizzly. You know, the usual Tuesday afternoon entertainment." The bar fell silent again, all eyes on Chuck. Then from the back of the room, a voice piped up. "Bull shit." It was Old Man Jenkins, the town's skeptic and self-proclaimed voice of reason, a title that was hotly disputed by anyone who had heard him expound on his theory that the government was secretly run by a cabal of hyper-intelligent squirrels. "Ain't no way you wrestled a grizzly and lived to tell the tale," Jenkins continued, his roomy eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Next thing you'll be telling us is that you arm-wrestled Bigfoot and won." Chuck's grin, if possible, grew even wider. "Well, funny you should mention that, Jenkins. There was this one time up in the Rockies." As Chuck launched into his tale, embellishing it with each retelling, the patrons of the Rusty Nail Saloon settled in for what promised to be an entertaining afternoon. So beers were ordered, bets were placed on how outrageous the story would become, and at least one person started taking notes for their upcoming novel, Grizzly Grappler, the Buck Boomstick Bronson story. Little did they know that high above their heads in a cloaked alien observation pod, 2 extraterrestrial scouts were frantically documenting every word, trying to understand the bizarre species that had just inadvertently thwarted a galactic invasion. Back in the pod, Krell and Blip were beside themselves with a mixture of fascination and horror. "Are you getting all this?" Krell chittered excitedly, his antennae quivering with each new outlandish claim from Chuck. Blip, who had been furiously inputting data into their system, nodded. "Every word. Though I'm having trouble translating some of the terms. What in the name of the Hive Mother is a hootenanny? I think it's some sort of ritualistic combat dance," Krell offered helpfully. "Remember that documentary we watched on human mating rituals?" "Ah, yes." Blip nodded sagely. "The one with the flashing lights and the strange beverages that seemed to impair cognitive functions. Fascinating stuff." And as they continued to monitor the scene in the bar, the 2 aliens found themselves growing increasingly perplexed by human behavior. The more Chuck talked, the more outrageous his stories became, and yet his fellow humans seemed to be enjoying it immensely. "I don't understand," Krell said after a particularly wild tale involving Chuck, 3 moose, and what was apparently a banjo duel. The aliens made a mental note to research this potentially lethal musical weapon later, but why are they encouraging him to exaggerate? Don't humans value truth and accuracy? Blip, who had been consulting their database on human psychology, offered a tentative explanation. "According to our records, Humans have a strange appreciation for what they call tall tales. It seems to be a form of recreational dishonesty that serves as entertainment. Recreational dishonesty, Krell repeated, his compound eyes blinking in confusion. You mean they lie for fun? Apparently so, Blip confirmed. It seems to be particularly common in social gatherings involving the consumption of fermented beverages. As if on cue, Chuck's voice rose above the general hubbub of the bar. And that's when I said to the Sasquatch, "Listen here, you overgrown shag carpet. I don't care if you are the missing link. In these parts, we play poker with real money, not beef jerky." The bar erupted in laughter, and even Old Man Jenkins seemed to be grudgingly impressed. Krell and Blip exchanged glances, their alien minds struggling to comprehend the scene before them. "But you know," Krell said slowly, a note of wonder in his voice, "I'm starting to think that calling off the invasion might have been the best decision we've ever made." Blip nodded in agreement. "Indeed. Can you imagine trying to subjugate a species that treats mortal combat with apex predators as a casual, afternoon activity? Not to mention their ability to consume substances that would kill most sentient beings and consider it an enjoyable pastime," Krell added, watching as Chuck downed another beer with alarming speed. As the night wore on, and Chuck's tales grew ever more fantastical, the two alien observers found themselves oddly captivated. There was something almost admirable about the human zest for life, their ability to find joy and humor in the face of a hostile universe. "You know," Blip said thoughtfully, as Chuck launched into yet another improbable adventure, this one involving a jet ski, a flock of angry Canadian geese, and the Loch Ness Monster. "Perhaps we've been looking at this all wrong." "What do you mean?" Krell asked, tearing his eyes away from the spectacle below. "Well," Blip explained, his antennae waving excitedly, "instead of seeing humans as a potential conquest, maybe we should be studying them. Think about it. A species that not only survives, but thrives on a death world, that seeks out danger for fun, that can turn even the most harrowing experiences into entertaining stories. There's so much we could learn from them." Krell considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You know, you might be onto something there, but how do we convince the High Command? They're not exactly known for their open-mindedness." Blip's mandibles clicked in what passed for a grin among their species. "Leave that to me. I think I have an idea." 3 solar cycles later in the Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Federation, Grand Admiral High Overlord Varnox stood before the assembled leaders of 1,000 worlds, his tentacles fidgeting nervously as he prepared to make his presentation. Behind him, a large whole screen flickered to life, showing images of Earth and its inhabitants. "Esteemed members of the High Command," High Overlord Varnox began, his voice echoing through the cavernous chamber, "I come before you today to propose a radical change in our approach to the planet known as Earth." A murmur ran through the assembled aliens, ranging from curious chirps to skeptical growls. High Overlord Varnox took a deep breath, or the equivalent for a being that breathed through spiracles, and continued. "As you know, our initial plan was to invade and conquer this Class 5 death world. However, based on new intelligence gathered by our scout team, I believe this would be a grave mistake." The murmuring grew louder. A Zablaxian counselor rose from his gelatinous seat, his eye stalks quivering with indignation. "A mistake. But Grand Admiral, surely these primitive bipeds are no match for our advanced technology." High Overlord Varnox held up a tentacle for silence. "That's what we thought, Counselor. But observe." With a flick of his appendage, he started the recording. The assembled aliens watched in stunned silence as the now infamous scene of Buck Boomstick Bronson wrestling the grizzly bear, played out before them. As the video ended with Chuck's triumphant laughter echoing through the forest, the council chamber erupted into chaos. Impossible. Surely this is some sort of trick. No sentient being would willingly engage in combat with such a creature. High Overlord Varnox waited for the commotion to die down before speaking again. I assure you, esteemed colleagues, this is no trick. This is but one example of the incredible resilience and, frankly, insanity of the human species. He flicked through more images. Humans climbing sheer cliff faces without safety equipment, diving into ocean depths that would crush most beings, and even willingly ingesting substances that caused them to experience altered states of consciousness for fun. These humans, High Overlord Varnox continued, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation, not only survive on their death world, but they actively seek out danger and challenge their limits. They turn their brushes with death into entertaining stories. They have developed cultures and technologies uniquely suited to their harsh environment. He paused for effect, his eye stalks sweeping across the room. In short, my fellow beings, I believe that attempting to conquer Earth would not only be futile, but potentially disastrous for our Federation. The council chamber fell silent as the assembled aliens processed this information. Finally, the Empress of the Hive Collective spoke, her crystalline voice cutting through the tension. What do you propose then, Grand Admiral? Surely we cannot simply ignore such a potentially dangerous species. High Overlord Varnox's mandibles clicked in what might have been a smile. No, Your Luminescence. I propose something far more radical. I believe we should invite them to join the Galactic Federation. The chamber exploded into noise once again, but this time there was an undercurrent of excitement mixed with the shock and disbelief. So the various counselors debated the merits and risks of High Overlord Varnox's proposal. The Grand Admiral allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Somewhere on Earth, blissfully unaware of the interstellar debate he had sparked, Buck Boomstick Bronson was probably embarking on another death-defying adventure, and thanks to him, the course of galactic history was about to change forever. As the Council's deliberations continued long into the night, one thing became abundantly clear. The universe would never be the same now that humanity was about to step onto the cosmic stage. And if the other species of the galaxy thought they were prepared for what was coming, well, they had another thing coming. After all, they hadn't met Florida Man yet, Anne.